This is Ayani.
And this is Corinne.
And you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sex, Love, Literature with your favoriteest hostesses with the mostesses. Myself, Ayani, and Corinne.
Hello.
Hello from both of us. So as we teased last episode, we're very excited to do 2 episodes this month. Are you laughing?
Also, as we've been teasing since like October, we are finally talking about Schitt's Creek.
Yeah, it only took us 3 months to do it, but we did it, which means that we're not liars. We just have a poor sense of time.
Which, like, it's a pandemic. Who doesn't?
Yeah, time is pretend anyway. What is time? What is time? Which is totally going to work when we're like not grad students anymore and have to go into jobs, you know?
Speak for yourself. I'm never getting a job.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, our depressing conversations about our employment potentialities aside. As Corinne said, we are going to be talking about Schitt's Creek today. This is going to be a little bit different than what we've done in previous episodes, though, because we are focusing on a specific episode rather than trying to tackle all 6 seasons of Schitt's Creek in one go. So we'll see how this goes. It's an experiment. I'm sure we'll do great. Close reading is like what English majors do, so we've got this.
That's true.
We've got this. So for some context, to start us right off from the top, Schitt's Creek was created by David and Eugene Levy, a father and son combo. It is a Canadian show that was apparently on the CBC television in Canada, but it was on Pop TV in the US and is now available. All 6 seasons and a special are on Netflix, which is actually, I think, how a lot of people are watching it right now.
Yeah, I know I picked up Schitt's Creek, I think, before the last 2 so I picked it up, I think, when 3 seasons had aired. I picked it up because it was on Netflix, and that's the same for a lot of people. Like, that's when it started to really gain popularity and what allowed it to continue.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because I don't have Pop TV. We are one of those people that like cut cord completely. We don't have any normal kind of cable television. So there's no way I would have watched Schitt's Creek if it hadn't come to Netflix.
And if I hadn't bullied you into watching it.
Well, yeah, but we've well established that is the kind of person that you are.
Also, for Schitt's Creek, I tried to make Ayani and Andrew watch it like some time ago.
Yeah,
and we only got like 2 or 3 episodes in, and then they quit. So,
well, I'm gonna put a pin in that because that's actually something I've heard from a lot of people about Schitt's Creek. But just to finish catching us up on the quick about, since it's a sitcom, it's not like we're going to go really deep into what the show is about, but for, to set up, it ran from 2015 to 2020. It just ended, you said like 6 months ago?
I think in April.
And it's won 9 Emmys for its final season, which is super impressive to me, at the very least.
They swept the acting awards. It was amazing.
Oh, I believe it. The 6th season was a really good season, but a lot of people have actually been watching it because of the pandemic. I mean, television and other screen time has increased dramatically, and I know I've seen at least 3 people on my, Twitter scrolling that have been like, what's this Schitt's Creek thing? I'm gonna pick it up. Why not? To rewind to the point about the first couple of episodes and then stopping, a lot of people have commented that the first season is a little bit more difficult for them to get through. And I think that was the case for me also. I was kind of like, oh, I'm not too jazzed about this. But once I got like a little into season 1, I was like, okay, I'm more invested in who these characters are now. They became a little less archetypes, right?
Well,
of spoiled rich people.
It also kind of switches from this like fish out of water train wreck kind of comedy to like actually being invested in who the characters are as people.
Right.
So like instead of like being invested in what is the most awkward, embarrassing thing that can happen, you become invested in their success and in their character growth, which is maybe a good time to introduce who the characters are.
Oh, well, really quickly.
Okay.
give a little bit of you so wonderfully put the IMDb summary here, so I should at least give us that.
Whatever.
So I want to honor your hard work, Corinne. But
yeah, my hard copying and pasting.
Girl, don't sell yourself short, man. Don't sell yourself short. But so just for that little bit of summary, when a rich video store magnate, Johnny Rose, and his family suddenly find themselves broke, they are forced to leave their pampered lives to regroup in Schitt's Creek. And we're going to get into the characters, but for just to set the stage, we're actually doing a deep dive of the season finale of episode 4. So there's already been a lot of the character growth that we're talking about, which makes the characters so lovable. And this episode, I believe it's called Singles Week, aired on April 10th of 2018. And I think the timeline was always a little hard for me to understand because I think I binged it. Yeah. But it takes place a couple years after the Roses have moved to Schitt's Creek. So they've already become kind of established in the community. People know who they are. They're building different kinds of relationships, having their own squabbles, etc., etc., etc. So on that, we can tilt to the characters of import.
Yes, now I will actually introduce them. So the 4 main characters on whom the show focuses are the Rose family. So we have the 2 children, David Rose, played by Dan Levy. He runs a small store in, what does he call it? A general store, I think?
It's an apothecary.
An apothecary, which is like a small specialized general store, which you just suspend your disbelief and assume that there is enough of a market to keep it going in this town. It's lovely. Dan Levy is a treat. David is an amazing character. He's great.
Yep.
We have Alexis Rose, played by Annie Murphy. She is my personal favorite character. She's a mess.
Yes.
And I love her. And then we have the matriarch and patriarch of the Rose family, Johnny Rose, played by Eugene Levy, and Moira Rose, played famously and iconically by Catherine O'Hara. We're not necessarily going to talk that much about Johnny in this episode, but we are going to talk some about Moira. And then we are also going to talk about David and Alexis's partners. David's partner is Patrick Brewer, who is played by Noah Reed, and then Alexis's partner, Ted Mullins, who is played by Dustin Milligan.
Excellent. So not quite the same like huge stable of characters that we normally have, but they're each kind of, except for Johnny, as Corinne said, they kind of all play a major role in this episode of Schitt's Creek.
And there definitely are a number of other recurring characters that are important to the show and that are important to giving the show its kind of charm. So like we have, obviously they're like Stevie, and then we have like Bob, and we have the Schitts.
Yeah.
And
Roland
like
and
Jocelyn,
thank you. And they do have an important role in this episode because, well, really quick, before I say that, we do want to note that this is clearly going to have spoiler episodes, or
I'm already spoiling it by saying who ended up with who in our character rundown.
Yeah. So. But one of the things that we're going to do a bit later in the episode is kind of think of this moment in Schitt's Creek, right? Singles Week, this season finale in the context of the grander show. So if you haven't watched Schitt's Creek, or you want to remain unspoiled for the end of the show, seasons 5 and season 6, we'll give a heads up that we're heading in that direction. But that is something that we're going to be kind of thinking about and unpacking a little bit towards the end of the show.
Yes.
But anyhow, so Jocelyn has her baby this episode. So she, Roland, and Moira definitely kind of factor in that way. But we're going to steer a little bit more to kind of thinking about 3 particular relationships and how this episode functions as a sort of linchpin or key turning point in these relationships. So the first one we're actually going to be thinking about is Alexis and her mother, Moira. So it might be helpful to kind of start with where the family is this episode, where we're kind of situating with the Roses, what's happening with them, how their lives are a bit different, and also how they're kind of interacting with each other. The familial love part of relationships.
Yeah. So kind of, I think something that is very interesting about this show is how the family's relationships have developed since the beginning. Like, I think one of the things that I do like about it a lot is that, like, Moira and Johnny have always had a very good, solid relationship.
Loving, communicative, yeah.
And, like, they're both nutty in their own ways, but, like, they love and appreciate each other, but they don't necessarily know their children that well. And particularly Moira and Alexis's relationship has always been a little bit fraught. And part of that is because Alexis has a history of, like, globetrotting, and, like, there's a ongoing bit where Alexis will, like, just come out with something absolutely insane that has happened to her. So, like, it is not, and that, like, that Johnny and Moira will, like, be surprised by and be like, "Excuse me, what?
When did this happen?"
But, like, this is then an ongoing thing in the show that, like, Alexis and Moira, like, there's an episode earlier where, like, they like, have lunch together, just the two of them.
I was thinking about that too, yeah.
And it's so awkward and uncomfortable. So when we, like, meet them in this episode, they've been planning together, well, ostensibly together, the Singles Week event that Moira has helped to put on as part of the town council, and Alexis has put on, like, as, like, the key event planner after graduating from, well, I guess getting a certificate from college. I don't know.
Yeah.
Alexis has been doing a lot of work on herself.
Yes.
What is it? She says she's been working very hard on herself. And we do see a lot of that growth in this episode, and also in Alexis and Moira's relationship.
Right. So where we're kind of starting off at the very beginning, though, is Alexis has very, very clearly been putting a lot of her blood, sweat, and tears into Singles Week. And Moira kind of comes in the end in her very grandiose fashion and says, okay, well, I'm going to take it from here, which definitely rubs Alexis the wrong way. But interestingly, she kind of acquiesces. Acquiesces, thank you. Even though we're clearly seeing that her feathers are ruffled about it. She's clearly upset because of how much effort that she's put in. And because I think Singles Week is one kind of a capstone on that particular track of her kind of trying to prove both to herself and to her family that she's more than just, like, a globe-trotting,
Playgirl.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good term. And that, she quote unquote has value and things like that. But also, and we're going to come back to them, but she's coming off of kind of being rejected by Ted, right? Because Ted has a girlfriend, but Alexis has realized that she loves him, told him so, and that did not go how she wanted it to. So she's kind of in an emotionally sensitive place when we start this episode. And Moira, and correct me if I'm wrong here if you disagree, but Moira is not, I think, the most emotionally intuitive person in the show. And sometimes in a kind of self-centered way, she doesn't always see why her family members might be feeling some way about something. So, because I think she's a little blinded by the fact that the press is going to be there, she's like, oh, I'm going to take the reins from here.
Well, and, like, that's also, I think, just part of Moira's personality. Like, she's a former soap star. She was, like, a huge part of Sunrise Bay, which is the in-universe show that she starred on, and, like, that was really all she did.
Right.
But, like, she rides that for all it's worth. But she just has this huge actressy personality, and she loves the spotlight. She loves the limelight. She loves the attention, and takes it where she can.
Right. But what happens here is that Moira gets wrapped up in the whole Jocelyn is giving birth storyline. So Alexis is the one that's kind of left to handle things. So something that's interesting in this episode, and I think we're going to come back to kind of in some of the other relationships as well, is that a lot of the characters have these kinds of moments of acknowledgement about someone either that they've been taking for granted or they haven't been thinking about them at their full potential or whatever, but not with that character specifically. So Moira and Jocelyn have this conversation about Alexis, in which Moira realizes that Alexis is more capable, has been working hard on herself, et cetera, in ways that she hadn't thought about before, but she's getting that through Jocelyn, which I think was a kind of interesting move.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how other characters sort of like have almost a better view into these relationships than the people in the relationships, and how the show is using that as a device both to like sort of enlighten the character but also clue the audience in to what's happening.
Yeah, because on one hand it might feel like presumptuous or a little nosy for someone else to come from the outside and be like, hey, so your daughter is actually not as much of a screw up as you think she might be. That's not how Jocelyn said it. Jocelyn said it in a much nicer way. But I do think if we're thinking about kind of how that scene is constructed, right? Jocelyn is literally on a bouncy ball?
And like an exercise ball.
Yeah.
In labor,
right? But there's this kind of through line of mothering and motherhood in that sequence, in that Jocelyn has an older son, Mutt, who's like 30 something, right?
And he's an adult. He's grown.
Yeah. But there's this kind of conversation happening between mothers, which makes me feel as a viewer that Moira is perhaps more open to listening to what Jocelyn has to say about these kinds of things, about being a mother and seeing your children in a different light.
It's also really interesting, although it's not our focus, like an interesting moment in Moira and Jocelyn's friendship.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Which is, I think, one of the most interesting, unexpected ones of the show. And that, like, Moira has reached a place where she, like, respects what Jocelyn has to say enough to listen to her. And to, like, go, and I mean, even just to, like, go with Jocelyn to the hospital. Like, she makes Jocelyn drive herself, which is absolutely nutty.
No, wait, hold on. Do you think she made Jocelyn drive, or was Jocelyn just like, I'm going to do this, and took the reins? Because Jocelyn,
Moira is not going to drive. Like when Moira says, like, she insisted, like, no, she didn't. No.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but very fair.
But Moira did choose to stay at the hospital until Jocelyn's husband, Roland, could get there.
Right.
Despite this, like, siren call of, like, being in front of the cameras and press and everything at this singles event that Alexis has been putting on.
Right. Yeah, and then kind of at the end of the episode when they come back together, Moira has this big moment. And I think in particular, it's very, I used big, so just to use the big again, it's big and important because we had already had these awkward interactions between the two of them in which we realized that they were not on the same page about a lot of things, or that they thought they knew each other, but that connection wasn't really there, in which Moira acknowledges and sees Alexis for who she is and who she's becoming.
And for her, how capable she really is.
Right. And it's the kind of relationship change that carries through the rest of the season, I think. And means a lot to Alexis, who I think has been trying to prove something to herself for a really long time. Like, I know for me, there are moments when I'm like really trying hard to prove to myself that, like, for example, I deserve to be in a PhD program or whatever, right? And having that outside voice from somebody that not only that I trust, but that I care about, that's like, no, you're kicking ass and you deserve to be here, sometimes can just help you get over that hump, you know? Though I will say that prior to that, Alexis has this kind of speech moment that about Ted that kind of ties into this moment of Moira acknowledging her and seeing her, if that makes sense. This kind of feels like a good time to transition to thinking about Alexis and Ted, but did you have anything else you wanted to say about Moira and her relationship kind of at this point?
Not specifically, but like this sort of transitioning to thinking about Alexis and Ted, I think the Singles Week event is a really good centerpiece for the season finale. I think especially as the show goes on, like I'm specifically this season, which ends with like Singles Week, and then next season which ends with like the production of Cabaret. They've done a really good job in this show, and also like the last season, which ends with you know what, which I will not spoil in case people haven't finished it.
Not yet.
Of like centering them on these like big events and that like the different characters intersect with in different ways. So like with Alexis and Moira, like they center on Singles Week as co-hosts. With Alexis and Ted, like Alexis hosting this singles week event and like organizing it and putting it on, like sort of puts in stark relief her own singleness and like
Mm-hmm.
forces her to dwell on it in a way that like a lot of the times, like I know like when I'm unhappy about something, I will often use work as like a coping and distraction
Oof.
mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
then like I think in this case both is good for Alexis and that like it is distracting, but also in another way it's not distracting at all because it's reminding her that like Ted, whom she dated very early in the show and then like got engaged to and broke up with, and it was a whole mess at the beginning,
Oh yes, a
but
mess.
like who she does need, because it's a very small town, she does need to work with in some capacity. Like there's an adoption event, so Ted is a vet and is also like the only medical professional in town, which is funny. But there's like an adoption event that is happening as part of singles week, so like she is still working with Ted, and like in
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the most memorable moments of the show for me is actually the end of the episode before this one, where Alexis decides to tell Ted that she loves him and is in love with him. Mhm.
Really quickly, was it Alexis was working with him as his kind of like secretary and assistant before this, right?
Yeah, so the sort of path of their relationship is they date in the first season and then they break up at the beginning of the second season. And then at some point, I don't remember exactly where in the second and the third season, Alexis needs a job because her family
Right.
needs money. So
Mm-hmm.
Ted gives her a job as the front desk lady,
Yeah.
administrative
Mm-hmm.
assistant at his like small vet clinic. So she's
Right.
basically the person working with him to do that, which she is not technically qualified to do.
No.
But so like at some point Alexa sort of realizes this and quits
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what it is she does want to do, which it turns out is become a publicist, which then a publicist and like event organizer.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But so she's quit working with Ted, she realized she's in love with him and she made a mistake and decides to tell him this to sort of, I think without any expectation, but just to like
Right. Right.
put it out there and move on. Like the way she introduces it in at the beginning of this episode is like
Mm-hmm.
she's like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
like I've closed a very important chapter of my life and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I need to move on."
Right. Yeah, and it's funny too because it feels like all of the time that she spends working with Ted is how she really comes to appreciate him,
Mhm.
right? Because one of the things that comes to the surface in this episode is that perhaps she was taking Ted for granted, but also not seeing him with how do I want to put this? Not with open eyes. That's a kind of silly expression, but
Well, it's like she had a lot of preconceived notions about what she
yeah,
wanted from a partner and a relationship that were set in like her previous life almost.
right. And also, she seemed like the kind of person who dated a lot of people
Mhm.
and didn't necessarily spend a lot of time single. Just
Mhm.
and that's just my reading. Like you're 100% free to disagree, but like a lot of her stories are about the different men that she dated across the world,
And also,
right?
like, men that it sounds like were not really that good to her.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Which is really important.
Like, there's a one of the bits is like that. Oh, like a Saudi prince maybe who was like holding her captive that she
Yeah.
was
Mm-hmm.
dating, and then
Mm-hmm.
like the man who she's dating at the beginning of the show, like he's like a wealthy
Is it
person,
Stavros? Is that his
Stavros,
name?
yeah,
Yeah.
and he's supposed to like come get her to like rescue her and sweep her away, and then he doesn't. He
And
like
ends up
fails
and doesn't he end up dating somebody else like shortly after that?
like immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, so it doesn't it felt like Alexis had built up this kind of story, and also she says this in this episode, but this kind of story of what a man that she dates needs to be, the kind of person that he needs to be, etc.
So like there's actually, I think it's actually a really cheesy but lovely metaphor that she uses. So like there's it in the episode for the singles week, there's an event that's supposed to be like a lock and key thing where like,
Yeah.
oh, it's so Freudian. Like I can't. But
So it's actually really funny. Well, I'll let you explain, but like I used to in one of my previous jobs, I used to run speed dating events. So all
Mhm.
of these different kinds of things that they do to like get singles to talk to each other, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of my old job. But go ahead.
But so like also, and we should, just as a side note, think about almost the gender normativity of Singles Week, which is something that the more I watch this episode, I get
Mm,
uncomfortable with. So like that in this show, which has such like a good queer relationship in David and Patrick, that there is
mhm,
a lot of sort of gender normativity built into the Singles Week events. And granted, we only see one of them, but like in this lock and key event, men have locks and women have keys, and you go
mhm.
try and match. And Moira is supposed to bring the locks and keys, and she doesn't because she gets derailed. So Alexis like has them do basically a musical chairs thing instead.
Yeah.
Anyway, the gender normativity is a side note that I can't not see now.
No. And I think that's an important side note. So, like, kind of pulling from my experience doing these kinds of events, right?
Mhm.
Usually, when we would build them and advertise them, they would be billed as for like women seeking men and men seeking women,
Mhm.
or if it was specifically for women looking for women, because of the nature of how speed dating works, the fact
Yeah.
that you're moving from one seat to the next with everyone that you're meeting or seeing being a potential match, right?
Mhm.
So I'm not disagreeing with you. Not saying that I disagree with you, but I'm wondering if because of how smart the show is in those contexts,
Mhm.
right? I'm wondering if this was just a moment of like, okay, this is what they chose to display.
Mhm.
So, yada yada. And if that's something that would have been thought of in a longer context. But again, that's extrapolating on stuff that's not there.
Mhm.
So, I totally agree with you that, thinking about a lock and key event is definitely 100% heteronormative. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And that this kind of musical chairs event was specifically women sitting and men rotating, so
Mhm.
yeah. I wonder what other kind of representation we might have gotten if we had more time with Singles Week as an event.
Mhm. Yeah, and it is like it is a week, so like there is possibility there that like
Right.
anyway, that's not super
So I'm
important
I'm
here.
hoping that perhaps there's some fanfic writer that like picked that up and ran with it. The many possible events of Singles Week. I'll have to do a search on Archive of Our Own or something.
Yeah. But bringing it back to Alexis's speech, which is, I think, Alexis's key moment in this episode where we sort of see her growth, is
Yeah.
like she
Mhm.
says that
Mhm.
like she does this metaphor to explain why they're not going to do the lock and key event. They're going to do something
Mhm. Mhm.
else that helps, that encourages giving other people a chance. She talks about how like she had this idea of like what men should look like, and basically describes Stavros as like coming from like a long line of Adriatic royalty and being like really
Right.
aggressive. And then she talks about Mutt, who she has a fling with early in the show, and which side note, I was like incredibly invested in Alexis and Mutt at the beginning of the show, and like now Alexis and Ted are my favorite couple. So I don't know how I shifted there, but I shifted along with Alexis. So
Well, one of the things that's actually really weird about Mutt, and I don't want to linger here for too long, but like he was so heavily featured in the first season and
Mhm.
then is scarcely appears throughout the
Mhm.
rest of the show. So I don't, and maybe we could Google this at some point, but I don't know if he just was phased out. I don't know if it was a money thing. I don't know what happened, but
Mhm.
they decided to just not use him. So I
Mhm.
feel like part of the reason that you weren't invested is because the show wasn't invested in Mutt. Like
Mhm.
he literally went on a trip with his then girlfriend. He was put on a bus pretty much,
Mhm.
and sent away, and only comes back then for one episode to kind of be a thorn in the
Mhm.
relationship between Alexis and Ted.
Well, and he is the thing that sort of prompts Alexis in the previous episode to confess to Ted.
Mm-hmm.
Like it is her relight. Like Mutt goes to like make out, and she's like, better not.
Yeah.
And and then that's what makes her like go confess. So also like side note, I don't know that I would have used the phrase like confess in the same way without watching so much K drama. Because like there's like a different culture of like confessing one's feelings than I think we have
Mm.
necessarily,
At least in
particularly,
media, yeah.
yeah, or like at least confessing without an expectation of
Mm-hmm.
reciprocation afterward.
That sounds like a conversation for another day, but I would be kind of interested in maybe doing like choosing two shows and then comparing how that kind of stuff works. That'd be interesting. Make notes.
Well, and it is, I think, thinking about how Alexis and Ted like sort of get off the ground here in like this show versus like perhaps like a more traditional American rom-com film. Like the confession is almost immediately followed by reciprocation and like at the beginning of a relationship. Whereas in this, Alexis confesses, doesn't like Ted's basically like, I don't know what to say. And she's like, you don't have to say anything. And then she leaves. And then like it's been a week. She hasn't heard anything. She assumes that's the end. That's like a period. And she is, so in this speech that she gives where she like has this metaphor about locks and keys and talks about like what you think the lock you needed looked like,
right?
And that this lock, like, because it was too nice and like treated you well, that she like threw away without giving it a chance. Yeah, and then like being. I think it's really interesting how she like also talks about like being happy for him finding like another key.
Yeah,
and like one thing that I always find super, super compelling in media is when like someone's first relationship isn't their only relationship, like especially because I study YA a lot, that like your first love doesn't have to be your only love. So this like idea, even though Alexis and Ted do end up together, that like you can have more than one key that fits.
Right. And I think the purpose of her kind of broadening in that from saying we're not doing a lock and key game anymore, we're doing something that allows you to give people chances in the musical chairs really speaks to that it's not about the one true love in this case. It's about experiencing different people and what they can bring to the table, even though I know like Alexis and Ted are your OTP from the show. You know,
I realize I'm contradicting myself here. So
no, it's okay. I mean, you're not living their relationship, you're watching it, so it's different. But I kind of actually want to go back to your thought process about the fact that there's not immediate reciprocation after the confession. And to me, though, it still feels very much like a kind of somewhat standard rom-com situation, though, because even though it's been a week in their time, it's literally just an episode for us for that tension. You know what I mean?
Which is maybe also interesting to think about when you're watching the show live versus watching like binge watching.
Very true. Yeah.
If you watched it when it was airing, I don't remember if I watched this one when it was airing or not. But like if you're binging, it's like 10 minutes later. If you're not, it's a week.
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, again, not the topic for this podcast, but something to really think about is how we intake television impacts how we think about it, you know, because if you're binging something, you are getting all of that information right away, right? So like some shows are made to be binged, you know what I mean? While other shows kind of are made to take into account that there's going to be that space of time in between almost, you know what I mean? Like the difference between how you're quote unquote supposed to experience Stranger Things versus what the original experience of, you know, Schitt's Creek was. I think that's an excellent point, that maybe when it was originally made, there is that week of time. So you have to kind of sit with the fact that she was rejected. Whereas I didn't have to do that. Like I was like, I need to know what happens. And then in this next episode, they're getting back together again, right? That's the big culmination of the season is that Ted breaks up with the girlfriend that he had and comes to singles week to be like, hi, I'm Ted, and I've wanted to kiss you for the last 2 years. Of course, better written than that, right? But
I mean, I think that's like pretty close.
Yeah, well, he said, I wanted to do this for the last, I can't lie and say
every day for the last 2 years.
And then she's like, do what? And then they stand up and kiss, right?
I think it's really interesting as well how cinematic that moment is and how like...
What do you mean by that?
I think particularly I'm laughing at how absurd it is for them to like kiss and then have the room full of people clap for them.
Oh my god, yeah.
And how much like writing work they had to do to set that up in a way that it like it's still weird, but like it's not that weird.
So the thing that actually cracked me up watching it this time is that like they're standing in the middle and then the men just start rotating again.
And there's that man who like tries to kiss Twyla and she's like, oh nope, that's not what
thank you. So I do see what you mean about the kind of like standing up and clapping kind of thing. But I think, I mean, part of the comedy gold of Schitt's Creek is that they don't linger in those moments for too long. So even though they're like having their moment, we have that moment with that man that tries to kiss Twyla. And then the other guys are like, well, I'm still trying to get a date.
Again and
yeah. So
like, keep playing the game.
That show is such a mess. Oh, that's part of why it's so much fun though. Yeah, so that's kind of the culmination and the major turning point for Alexis and Ted here, in that they've both kind of had enough time to think about what they actually want, right? Before getting back together. Because honestly, one of the things about the first season in that relationship is like Ted. So I know that a lot of the show is set up to be like, Alexis shouldn't have said yes to being engaged and that she made quote unquote 2 mistakes. But like, bro proposed to her mad quick. It was really fast. And in a way, I don't know, it kind of feels like she said no without saying, she was like, oh, if we were staying, then I would say yes. But like that should kill you in that it's actually a no, bruh. You know what I mean? I don't know.
I remember as you were binging it, you were not as sold on Alexis and Ted as I was. I think because you had just watched season 1 Ted, who is very different than, or is less layered, I think, than Ted as we like, see him in future seasons. And like,
absolutely.
And like when I go back and rewatch Schitt's Creek, I do not like to rewatch season 1 because it makes me uncomfortable. I don't like lingering in the awkwardness. I think that's why some people have a hard time getting into Schitt's Creek, because it becomes a more warm-hearted show as it goes on.
Right.
So, like, for me, like, I remember Alexis and Ted of season 1, but they are not an immediate memory for me, because when I rewatch, I start at season 2.
Yeah, no. That makes sense. And you're right. They do feel like very, very different characters in that first season. And I guess for me, the fact that the first season tried to make it seem like it was all Alexis's fault, I did not like. Because
do you think that this episode makes it try and seem like Alexis's fault?
No, I think
it does.
I'm both. I think that there's kind of a through line, because you can't just ignore that the first season happened, right? I think there's this through line through the rest of the show that Alexis made 2 mistakes, and it was her mistake with Ted, whereas he really felt like, to me, that he was rushing to marriage and that it wasn't a conversation, right? It wasn't like, this is something that we want to do. This is something that we have talked about and are on the same page about, you know?
And in the first season, he didn't know Alexis, really. He just thought she was beautiful.
Yeah. And so for me, it's kind of like, if she didn't want to get married and she did what she had to do, then that's not a mistake. You know what I mean? And the fact that the show kind of holds it over her as a character, as a mistake that she made, like, yeah, I kind of understand that she needed to come to appreciate Ted, but also like Ted didn't know her and was rushing to marriage too, which is uncomfortable in its own right. But
no, I think that's also an important perspective to add, because I do have rose-colored glasses on when it comes to Alexis and Ted. So,
but I actually think this is a good place to kind of transition away from, or actually not quite away from them, but as we said, thinking about Moira and Alexis, Ted has a conversation with David that acts as his moment of thinking about Alexis in a different light, because David is like, you know, she's really honestly been thinking about you for the past 6 months. Your name is constantly coming up. She's not a completely different person, right? Because she's still herself, but she's not the same person that she was when she quote unquote took you for granted and made those 2 mistakes or whatever. But in the course of that conversation, David also starts thinking about his relationship with Patrick, who are my OTP from this show. I love David and Patrick. And I think part of what I really like about David and Patrick is that Patrick was introduced when the show kind of really had a feel for the kind of show that it wanted to be. So he was introduced with a sense of roundness and depth that wasn't afforded to Ted in that first season. And it made their relationship to me from the jump, I think, more like a push and pull that...
Like more balanced?
Yeah. In that David made mistakes, but Patrick also made mistakes. Like nobody was perfect. And
the show acknowledged that for both of them, yeah.
Right from right out the gate. So anyhow, I love David and Patrick. And this was an important episode for them because Patrick said, I love you for the first time. And... you say the quote really well, Corinne, but about who David has said I love you to in his life.
Yeah, he's twice to his parents and once at a Mariah Carey concert.
So, Patrick, David has come by with some dog sweaters that he's supposed to be bringing to Ted.
Because he is in distress.
Because he knows that Alexis said, "I love you" to Ted, and that Ted was like, "I don't know what to tell you." And he's like, "I don't want to be involved in this."
And it's like, and Ted knows that I know that he knows. And it's so funny. I love that scene. Like, side note, like, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I would like just put on random episodes of Schitt's Creek. And this is one that I have probably seen upwards of like 10 or 15 times. Because I would put this episode on like while I was like making dinner or folding laundry. So like there was a point that I have, I think, fortunately moved away from where I essentially had this episode memorized.
Well, and I mean, that's part of the reason why we're talking about it right now, right? Because there were a couple others that we were like, oh, maybe we'll talk about this one. Maybe we'll talk about this one. And it just kept coming back to singles week. So, but Patrick says, "I love you" to David. And what was really sweet is he's like, you don't have to say it back to me right now. I know that this is not what you do. When he says, "To me, you're my Mariah Carey," right? So then David kind of has a moment and is like, that could make me cry, but I'm not going to let it. Which, mood, that's how I feel about a lot of things. Like, I'm talking about my whole life right now, but Corinne and I got an email from my advisor that was pretty much just like, "Hey, I'm sorry I haven't necessarily been so communicative, but I really miss you guys and I appreciate having you in my life." And I was just like, I'm not gonna cry, which was a lie. It made me cry. Like, so I get David kind of on that level. Mm-hmm. But David has this moment where he's like, he goes away from Patrick with that kind of "I love you" hanging in the air. Mm-hmm. And Patrick feels perhaps that did not quite go as well as he wanted it to. Mm-hmm. Right, once David leaves. But in David's conversation with Ted, in trying to give Ted a pep talk about, you know, when there's someone that loves you and cares about you, you know, you don't want to necessarily just let that go.
And like, it's particularly like that, even like having been burned before, a lot of times, sometimes it does work out and sometimes people are happy together. And like, it's like this idea, like, if you've got it, take it, or something like that. I don't remember the exact wording.
Yeah, no. But that's pretty much it. It's kind of like, if it's presented to you, and it didn't feel like a forced kind of like, well, don't let love go, but more like, this is available to you if you want it, and if you can open yourself back up again to this.
Despite having been hurt before.
Right. So at first, it feels like David is talking to Ted, but then it becomes very clear that David is also talking to himself about his relationship with Patrick. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those interesting moments where I think for Ted, it's the outside opinion of David that leads him to Alexis. Mm-hmm. For Moira, it's the outside opinion of Jocelyn that leads her to kind of seeing Alexis in a different light. Mm-hmm. But for David, it's really him talking to himself and that kind of introspection about what Patrick means to him that brings him back to Patrick and enables him to then say, "I love you" to Patrick. Mm-hmm. To which Patrick is blown away and is like, "I know I'm not Mariah Carey, but like, this means a lot to me." Which I think is almost important for David as a character, because a lot of what David goes through, I think, is about himself and his past in a way that's kind of separate from Alexis. I think Alexis is trying to prove that she's not just who she was. She's not just a playgirl who can gallivant around the world. She can gallivant around the world, but also be a snazzy PR businesswoman, right? Mm-hmm. But for David, I feel like he has all of these wounds that are right below the surface.
Well, and like he's had all these relationships that were not balanced.
Right.
Like, he had a lot of people who took advantage of him that he considered his friends that weren't really.
Right. And I think relationships broadly is really important here, because it's not just romantic relationships. It's just all of his interpersonal relationships, I think, felt a little fraught. Like, even in the beginning with his family, things were a little rocky, right? And I think that's why, for a large part of the series, his most important relationship is his friendship with Stevie. And even though I think they have that little, like, sexual tryst for a season, I think that was, like, season 2, right?
I think it might have been season 1.
Was it season 1?
Well, because they have that, like, weird dinner where like Ted like announces that David and Stevie had slept together. That's like the first time Ted and Alexis are dating, and like it is a lot.
Yeah.
It is leaning into the awkward in a way that I am surprised I survived.
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I am surprised you made it through season 1 with like your need to not watch awkward things. But I feel like a lot of David needed that kind of foundation of friendship that he found in Stevie before.
Yeah, he needed to have like a healthy relationship,
period,
of like a friendship relationship in order to be able to have a healthy romantic relationship.
Right. And part of that, I think, is giving him the steady feet to kind of deal with his relationship with Patrick. But also because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is the first time Patrick has a relationship with another man. Because I think he had been trying to convince himself for his entire life that he was into women, but that wasn't the case. So David needed to be in a place where he was also comfortable enough in who he was and what he wanted in order to kind of build this relationship with Patrick. I think.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I agree.
Yeah. So anyhow, by kind of having this I love you exchange, this is such a huge turning point for both of them. You know, in that David is he calls himself the human incarnation of a burnt marshmallow, or the inside of a burnt marshmallow. So that he is able to feel comfortable enough saying I love you back to Patrick I think it's huge for him as a character. And it just, Patrick is just fantastic. So like, yeah.
That's very true.
Yeah. So I kind of gabbed on about that for a minute, but like, did you have any thoughts about them? I know that you are definitely more invested in Alexis and Ted, but
I think I just really like maybe thinking about why this episode and why like I like this episode so much.
Yeah.
I like it because it's like such a key moment both for Alexis and Ted and for David and Patrick, and just like I think it's really good storytelling with the way and we've said this already, but the way these different relationships are sort of like compared and contrasted with each other.
Yeah.
And also I just like I think it's really cleverly written in the way that like they also like there's a joke about Patrick like having asked David to also get him a cup of tea, and then when David says like, oh, I love you, is like, this is just like one of those perfect moments you dream about, except in my dream I'm also holding a cup of tea. But like they use that then to have David there at the cafe
right
when Ted shows up for Alexis, so like it's just interwoven really, really beautifully.
No, I 300% agree with you. So perhaps now is a good time to throw a little bit of a spoiler warning out there, because my brain is already thinking about, because of what you said about these two couples comparing and contrasting, thinking about where these relationships go in the future seasons. So if you have not watched past season 4 of Schitt's Creek, now is the time to pause and come back to this episode after you've completed things.
Or if you don't care about spoilers, or if you've already been spoiled by existing on the internet.
Watching too many GIFs on Tumblr.
Which is not a thing that I do, ever.
I wish you guys could see her face right now.
I'm certainly not spoiled for the K-drama we're watching, not at all.
Oh my god, wait, are you serious? Bud, I'm sorry. We're watching True Beauty right now, and it's a riot, and we might have an episode about it. Oh, but I'm sorry you got spoiled.
It's sometimes it's good, because it's like, I know a cameo is coming up that will like make my heart happy, but sometimes I know things that I work very hard to keep to myself, so I don't spoil it for Ayani.
Oh man, you should just not be on Tumblr right now. But anyhow, we're about to do what Corinne's Tumblr feed has done for her in throwing a bunch of spoilers out there for season 5 and season 6. So Ted and Alexis really go through a lot after this episode of them coming back together. But I think honestly, it was kind of a satisfying road for them in thinking about what they both want out of life, if what they want out of life can be achieved with the two of them together. And ultimately, they end up breaking up towards the end of season 6.
I was so upset.
Because of not I don't want to say irreconcilable differences. That sounds so hand wavy, but Ted gets his dream job in the Galapagos in kind of a research facility. And that's just not the life that Alexis wants for herself, no matter how much.
Well, and like, so in this in Singles Week, we see Alexis both starting a healthy relationship with Ted and sort of getting her career off the ground.
Right.
And her career gets going in a big way in season 6, and she can't move to the Galapagos and have a career at the same time. So like they have to make a choice, and that's the choice that they make.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we're not just kind of reducing it to a woman chooses a job over her man. Like, it's not just that kind of a thing, especially since I think Alexis, as we said earlier, has been trying so hard to prove to herself the kinds of things that she can do. These kind of leaps and bounds that she's making in her career are huge things that she has done for herself, and I think she needed to ride that wave and see where that was going to take her. So yeah, it was upsetting when they split ways, but like I wasn't mad about it. It made perfect sense to me in that kind of melancholy way.
Well, I just like really remember, I don't remember exactly what episode they broke up in, but it's like it's not that far from the end of the show, like the show finale, but I like only made it 1 or 2 episodes beyond that and then stopped watching until Ayani was doing her own binge. And I think part of it is because it like aired like right after the pandemic had started. I was already in my feelings about it being a pandemic. And then Alexis and Ted broke up, and I was just like, I cannot anymore. I'm done. Bye. And like stopped watching.
You poor thing. I'm sorry.
But I mean, I do think it was the right choice, and I do think it was perhaps brave of the show to have them break up, because like, I think it might have been in an interview or something that I read that like one of the difficulties of this sort of fish out of water show is like that at the end of it, like the different family members, they either need to leave or stay. And for each one of them, leaving or staying is in some way going to be sad.
Right. Yeah. And
that's what they're like setting that up for with Alexis and Ted breaking up.
Yeah. So I don't think either of us, I mean, you were clearly upset about what happened, but I don't think either of us was mad.
Yeah.
Like, I can't believe they would do this. It doesn't make sense.
Well, and I think part of the reason I was so upset is because it did make sense. And sometimes sometimes like no matter how much you love someone, it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And that's just the deal.
No, just the way you said that kind of like touched my heart a little bit. I was like, oh, bud, they were there. In contrast, however, in David and Patrick, they end up getting married. That's the finale for season 6 is them getting married, which of course you can have all kinds of commentaries you want about the institution of marriage and the fact that, you know, it's 2 gay men getting married, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was quite the wedding too, with Moira presiding over everything.
That is such an iconic image of
Moira,
it
pops
like
up everywhere.
Pope hat and the wig, and like it's so iconic of like the show and its whole vibe.
And it reminded me of, I think it was supposed to remind us of the Met Gala that year, where it was like the theme was like religion or what have you. I forgot what year that was though, if that was a year or 2 ago.
I think maybe it was camp for the most recent one, or
I think camp was the most recent one.
But it's definitely it was like the heaven and hell that Met Gala was? Anyway, it was definitely reminiscent of that iconography.
Yeah. And the big thing for them was not so much that they were going to be together, but where they were going to be together. And if we're thinking about kind of through lines from the Singles Week episode through to here, one of the things that, because David always wants to go back to New York, which as somebody who used to live very close to New York and now lives very far away from New York,
the city.
The city. I mean, that's what it is. It's the city. This is what I get moving away, is that people laugh at me for that. And they're like, what city? And I'm like, what do you mean, what city? There is only one. But anyhow, I can understand this drive to want to move back to that place. But David has to kind of weigh what that place means to him. And I think he and Patrick have a conversation where Patrick is like, why do you want to go back to this place where nobody valued you? Was that Patrick? I think it was.
It was Patrick, and I think he also had some version of that conversation with Stevie.
Which makes sense. So he has to kind of come to terms with place, but throughout the show, we see him making these roots in Schitt's Creek. You know, with Stevie being his real first friend, with opening the Rose Apothecary, you know, with meeting Patrick and wanting to spend the rest of his life with Patrick. Because he tries to uproot both Stevie and Patrick and bring them back to New York. But Patrick ends up buying them a little house that David had said that he loved in their kind of off-screen interactions with one another. And they ultimately decide to stay in Schitt's Creek. Which I think for all the characters, that was not the move I was expecting for them. But not in a way that I was like, this makes no sense. But if I go back and really think about it and think about the ties that David was making to the town and to the area, it makes a lot of sense. You know,
it also makes sense, I think, in the way that, like, I don't know, like, Patrick isn't a New York person, and David needed to make choices that also took into account what would make Patrick happy.
Right.
They needed to make choices as a couple, not
right.
like not as individuals anymore, and that I think is part of what was happening in their relationship, which is particularly interesting as balanced with Alexis and Ted.
Right. Yeah. They were able to kind of find this middle ground that worked for them in a way that Ted and Alexis couldn't. But I think what's important is that the show casts neither of these relationships as failures. In a way, some other shows might be like, oh, well, they broke up, so it's a failed relationship. And I think that's one of the things that really puts Schitt's Creek, if we're thinking about it in terms of romance and relationships, kind of over the top for me, is it really thinks about the variety of ways that romantic relationships, but also friendships, marriages, colleague relationships, the different kinds of faces that they can take and the different kinds of ways that they can go, and kind of respecting that life is multifaceted and not every relationship is going to end with, you know, lifelong partners sitting on a porch together. And that's okay.
I do really like, and I think this is maybe obvious, but I think it still bears repeating, that it is really nice that this episode gives its main queer relationship a happy ending.
Yeah.
Which again, you both have to like look at shows and stories in isolation, but also like against the backdrop in which there's so much queer tragedy and suffering. Like, to give a queer couple a happy ending is revolutionary. And I wish it wasn't, but it is.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, I am totally happy to accept any disagreement to this point, but I feel like David and Patrick were handled really well over the course of the show.
Yeah, like one of the other episodes that we really thought about talking about was the episode in which Patrick comes out to his family, particularly as opposed to Happiest Season, the holiday movie that we did an episode on that did a horrible job of thinking about coming out.
Yeah.
This is like a comedy that did a really respectful, emotionally moving job of thinking about that. So
right.
Like, that is possible within this genre.
Right. In a way that Happiest Season kind of didn't. They missed what is it? Pass the buck? That's not the right one.
Missed the boat?
Missed the boat. They missed the boat.
So one other thing I do want to note is a critique that Glenn Weldon has made of the show, and he's a critic from Pop Culture Happy Hour because I am an NPR addict, so that is all I quote. But one problem that he has with David and Patrick's relationship is that David is Patrick's first partner that is a man. And perhaps it is not great for that to be his only relationship with a man.
No, that's fair. And it's funny because they kind of address that, but I don't think it in any way stifles the critique, you know? And I am a big proponent of, like, you should go out there and meet different people before you decide on who you want to settle down with and who you want to marry. So, yeah, that's a 100% fair critique.
I do think, I think my counter to that critique, despite being the one who brought it up, is that, like, I think the benefits of having a sort of, not exactly happily ever after, but, like, happily on the road to ever after, having that kind of queer relationship outbalances the need to, like, I don't know, sleep around. To put it really crudely.
Yeah, I was going to say, I never would have picked Patrick to be the kind to sleep around either, but that's not how he comes off. Yeah, and though I do want to poke a little bit at this idea of the happily ever after.
Yeah.
Because I think Schitt's Creek does a good job of showing that just because someone gets married doesn't mean it is a happily ever after. Because of all the time we spend with Moira and Johnny and the kind of stuff that they go through, the show, yes, it ends on an positive kind of upbeat mode, but because we've kind of followed David and Patrick's relationship, because we've had all of these different married couples that are around us in the show, I don't think it mythologizes marriage or makes it seem like it's going to be easy street for them from now on because they put a ring on it, you know?
Yeah, I think the show does a good job of setting us up, I don't know, for like a continued journey, even though the show is over and they are, and a lot of people are leaving Schitt's Creek, and even though like David and Patrick are staying, it's like we're leaving them to continue like muddling on. And that's, yeah, it both ends with like a good amount of satisfaction, but enough sort of open ends to like imagine them to keep on living, I guess.
Yeah. That their lives continue even though the show is over. That feels like a great place to kind of wrap up our Schitt's Creek discussion. So, what did you guys think of this deep dive episode? Is this the kind of thing that you might like to see from us in the future? Are there shows that you would like us to take an episode and kind of pick apart and think about? I had fun. So
yeah, I did too. And if you have Schitt's Creek thoughts, if you have something else you want us to watch, please find us at Sex Love Lit on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And we look forward to your feedback.
Yeah.
And of course, a very teachery thing of me to say.
It's okay. We can't help who we are. But also, do not forget to follow us on your favorite podcasting platforms of choice, be that Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Anchor, wherever you listen to us. Please don't forget to give us a follow. And for our next episode, what are we talking about?
Well, we are going to be venturing back into K-drama land, and we are going to have a special guest for the first time.
So we're super excited about that. We are actually kind of going back and forth between two K-dramas that we might talk about, so we'll leave that a little bit open, a little bit of excitement for you, but look forward to hearing an extra voice with us next time on Sex Love Literature.
Thanks for listening.